Yes, so for Lacan, there was a certain idea that he was progressing very much against the mainstream of psychoanalysis, especially in the US. And this is a certain idea that goes against the notion of objective reality. Huh? I just had this pamphlet printed called Against Reality. So this is a sort of a perspective that I think is quite Lacanian. Um, because for Lacan, reality and fantasy have the same structure.
Right.
It is a structure that sort of provides you with an access to some type of, let's say, interface, or let's call it film, uh, constantly promising that something will not be included within it. Because, the repressed needs to stay repressed. If it is not, it would be quite horrific. So, fantasy is a structure like this. It is a structure that Lacan describes like a film, mm, where the film stops at the frame exactly prior to a frame that would be too much, that would be that thing that is too real, that is too much to handle, that is has to stay sort of away from our perception. And in this sense, he uses cinema as a metaphor to describe this structure of fantasy. And you might know it from dreams that constantly defer a certain action. I don't know if you have these dreams sometimes where you have to go to the airport, you get into the car, but there's no gas, so you call a guy, but the phone doesn't work and
Sure.
it keeps on deferring. So you might view this as this type of a film which constantly defers the next frame. You never get there, but the fact of not getting there already provides you with some satisfaction.
Right.
So for Lacan,
So,
reality, our reality and our dreams, a fantasy and reality have the same structure. Through this endless deferral, we in fact are able to achieve some satisfaction and still remain, if I might use this term colloquially, sane. Mm.
right. So, okay. So, just to go a step back, with me today is Dr. Leon Brenner. He's at the Humboldt University, an expert on Lacan and autism. No, you're not at the Humboldt University right now?
No, not in the Humboldt side, no. Right now, I work in Bochum University and
Oh,
the
right. Okay.
ITU Berlin.
Right. Okay. Perfect. So we were just talking about the latest movie. We are welcome to the podcast first and foremost. We were talking about a little bit about the last movie, Kind Things. Now, what was the title from Yorgos Lanthimos?
Kinds of kindness.
Kinds of Kindness. Yes. And so there was a lot of to unpack there in what you said, because I mean, for Lacan, and you might correct me there, the real is obviously what he has this triad, the imaginative, the real, and the symbolic, right? And so, but the real doesn't refer to the real world, not
Right,
necessarily.
right, right,
So
exactly.
that's a very, I think that's one of the more um, complicated concepts. So why doesn't the real refer necessarily to the real world? Is there, and you indicated this, a lot of postmodern thinkers and philosophers and psychologists from the last 40 years pointed to the fact that, well, what we really see is a projection of
Mm,
psychological content. It's
mhm,
not the real world. We don't have access to the real world. That doesn't mean the real world isn't there,
mhm,
but we're
mhm,
like kind of trapped within the sphere of our cognitive, of our psychological cognition in a kind of way.
mhm, mhm.
And so how would you describe, how would you approach this kind of topic, this difference between the real world and Lacan's the real?
Oh, well, it's let's say utter opposites, we might say. Huh? Uh, I think Lacan is relying in his thinking on some other thinkers, actually from Germany, a particular thinker called Urskull, was working in the 30s. He was working on animals, and he has a very interesting book called Foray into. Do you know this one? I don't
What's the
remember.
title? What's the guy's name? I didn't get that.
Old school.
Old school. That sounds Swedish.
He's German. Let me find it. Anyways, I'll just speak about this. Yeah, Jakob von Uexküll. A
No, I haven't
foray,
heard of him. No. Okay.
foray into the worlds of animals and humans. It's a very influential book in ethology. And he coins this term, luckily enough, in German, you can say it, Umwelt. And, in English, it is usually translated into environment, which is a bit weird. It has many other connotations,
Right.
problem with translation. Huh? But many times in philosophical texts, it's translated to milieu.
Right.
Right. But in German, it's quite it's quite useful because in German we can say the Innenwelt, the inner
Right.
world, and the
Right.
Außenwelt, the
Right.
outer world. But
Mm.
then it's the Umwelt, right? It
Right.
is not the inner, not the outer. It's somewhere, maybe not in between, but it's something that is not this and not that. And I think that Lacan's conception of reality follows this notion, where we might say that the Innenwelt would be, I'm taking a gamble here, but I would say would be something more like the psychological disposition that the organism sort of has hardwired into its making. If we want to be a little philosophical, it might be these transcendental conditions that Kant speaks about, the space and time and the categories of reason or whatever, something that the subject comes already with sort of hardwired into the organism. And then there's the Außenwelt, which is exactly something that is completely ineffable, but we assume exists, right?
Right.
So the universe in its infinite capacity or whatever. But humans or organisms, they don't live in the Außenwelt, right? Because there is always sort of a limitation of, even we might say, our perception. This is what Uexküll is saying. That perception limits our capacity to fathom the universe. So there is some type of interface, some type of Umwelt that corresponds with the Innenwelt, corresponds with this hardwired propensity to perceive something, but for humans sort of surpasses it in the sense that, well, we base our experience in the world on our symbolic, phantasmatic developments that have nothing to do with our instincts. And for Lacan, we exist in this Umwelt. So this Umwelt is some kind of a making that is dependent on whatever substance we use as building blocks for it. And for Lacan, this substance is language.
Right.
And not language in the particular sense English. It's not that, they say that people have more words for white in particular places of the world, and this is why they perceive more white. This is not what Lacan is saying. It's not that words are building blocks, but language as some type of something that can function as a writing apparatus, something that can write, can inscribe, something that can remain.
Right. So just on a quick note, as far as I remember, Umwelt was always or originally like connotated for biological organisms.
Yes.
So you have, and so later on in systems theory, Luhmann, it was the difference between the system and the Umwelt. So you have Innenwelt and Außenwelt as a complementary kind of complementary terms, and then you have system and Umwelt as a polarity of terms. And so what Luhmann and the systems theory meant by this, that for example, social systems are kind of structurally coupled with psychological systems, but there are their respective Umwelt to each other. So, for example, if you look at social system and the conversations between us, our psychological content is the Umwelt of that system. And if I look at the psychological system, the social system is the Umwelt. But the point is, I can't really penetrate. I can't cross the threshold between those two systems. And that was meant by the system-Umwelt difference, at least in Luhmann's sociology, right?
Right.
So there is a
Exactly.
kind of, I can't access really the autopoiesis of the other system, let's say.
Yes, yes, exactly. There is a certain divide, and I think Lacan works on the question of this inaccessibility, this divide a lot because it causes a lot of problems for a lot of patients. A lot of patients sort of come to analysis with some complaints about this divide. It is, bothersome and sometimes excruciating. And we might say that psychoanalysis as a practice can be formulated as revolving around the question what to do with this divide.
Right.
Lacan
So
calls it
what is I mean, there are a couple of questions. So Lacan's psychoanalysis is that, I mean, what is the main difference to, let's say, Freud's psychoanalysis? And is it still something that is, I mean, you practice it obviously, but is it something that is a common practice? I mean, can you go to Bochum or Berlin and find a Lacanian psychoanalyst? Is that still a vital therapeutic tool? And
well,
what is it exactly?
okay. Well, yes, it is. I mean, if you go to the United States, it would definitely not be as prevalent as other forms of psychoanalysis.
Right.
The object relation psychoanalysis, as well as relational or ego psychology, which grew from other thinkers like Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Winnicott, Bion, etc. Lacan's school of psychoanalysis remains mainly in France and in South America. Surprisingly, it's very popular in South America.
Oh, well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. In Argentina and Brazil, I have a lot of colleagues that do many, many interesting
Why
things.
is that?
Come again?
Why is that? Why in South
I
America?
don't know. I have no idea. Some type of exportation of French culture, I would guess. I don't know, but it's
Right.
unbelievable. It's
Okay.
unbelievable. If you study psychology in Brazil or in Argentina, you study Lacan.
Oh,
It,
wow.
it,
Okay.
it's quite amazing. While here in Germany, and I teach in one program for clinical psychology, but most universities don't even have a seat of psychoanalysis in the psychology department.
Right.
Right? So yeah, we are in a crisis, that's for sure. And it's very important to make psychoanalysis relevant again, and it's something we're working on here in Berlin. But yeah, there's a group of young analysts, very inspirational, working under the Lacanian orientation here in Berlin, and we do a lot of
What is
work.
the Lacanian orientation? Can you give us a summary what that is?
Yes, of course. Maybe a summary of a summary.
Right.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Sure.
Um, well, Lacan is most notably known as calling for a return to Freud. So what we might call, and I'm using scare quotes, you see it, but I guess the listeners won't. So I'm using scare quotes here. The Lacanianism uh, is in fact a reaction to the stepping away from the original thesis of Freud that we see in the school of ego psychology and Anna Freud, and we see in object relation theory, where people become either post-Freudian, so going beyond Freud explicitly, saying, well, Freud, and maybe that is ethically viable. But there's also a lot of people in the time of Lacan that were completely betraying Freud's major assumptions, but calling themselves Freudian. So Lacan's psychoanalysis is an attempt to go back to Freud, to go back to Freud's original ideas and abide by them as fully as possible. The technicalities of the analysis rely on the assumption that the unconscious is structured like a language. This is a very famous aphorism from Lacan. So for Lacanians, the unconscious is not this sort of hidden, irrational cave with scary feelings or whatever. Yes, it is a place that works, that computes information, that functions according to laws that, well, if we had no idea what they are, we would not be able to do analysis in a serious way. Yes. So Lacan is interested in the way the unconscious works like a language, like a set of linguistic laws and rules, and the way these laws and rules manifest in what we call human suffering.
Okay,
And
so
this,
let's stop there for a second, because there is a misconception, and I'm very glad that you pointed out it is like language. It is not language, because the misconception that I know from German academia and philosophers is, that consciousness is language, which is not, right? It is like. So the rules, and because as far as again, you might correct me, as I understand what Lacan is saying, you can't have one idea or one term or one word without a topography of ideas and words and ideas that kind of inform each other, right? And so, right.
This is his kind of what we might call his semiotic turn. He reads Freud and he's explicit about it. He says Freud was a semiotician, he just didn't know it. Freud was reciting the Saussure without knowing it. He's saying, and this is the idea, yes, that the psyche, and you said consciousness. Let's stick with that, huh? With our conscious
I
experience
like
of the
psyche too, so we can go with psyche as well.
well, psyche would be a bit more wide than consciousness, as
Right,
we know, right? Consciousness
right,
is not the only aspect of the psyche, but consciousness is the experience that we have
right,
of our existence, and that this experience is not an experience of let's say that is reserved only to the level of meanings, as you would say, like an idea that is transparent to itself, that works by itself. It is always a network of interrelated, and I would say building blocks
right,
of presentation that is at work. And this is why our conscious experience is many times invaded by elements that, well, we are not so sure where they come from.
right,
And we consciously say, oh, I do not want that. You say, I don't want that. I want to get married, to have children, but whenever I meet someone I like, I immediately break up with them.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Why is that? This is a question that concerns a certain split. You say, I don't understand. I feel like I'm split. On the one hand, I want something. On the other hand, this thing, I keep doing this thing. And this question is a question that is the beginning of an analysis. This is what we start analysis with,
Right, right.
with a certain peculiar division within our experience of ourselves.
Yeah, well, John Donne said nobody is an island, and that's the starting point, no? So we have to contend with the fact there are influences and causal momenta that kind of influence what we're doing, and especially if you have kind of I don't mean this in a clinical sense, but we have so many different voices within ourselves that it's very hard sometimes to bring it all together and do things that we don't want to do at some point.
It is, in fact, impossible to reduce the psyche to the conception that Descartes presents to us in modernity. This self reflective, transparent, rational thinking being that Descartes is speaking about. And I think that psychoanalysis in general, many aspects of it, somewhat relies on this notion of subjectivity. And Lacan goes a bit sort of further in reading Descartes' Meditations. You surely know the book and the argument there, because Descartes reaches this idea of a thinking being. Yes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, but I am only a thinking being. I don't know what about the outer world. I have no idea. Maybe it's a fabrication. What about other people? What about science? What about... He has to call God to assist him in his
Right.
maneuver. He says, well, I have all these ideas and they might be a lie, but there is a God and he surely is eternal and he surely will not lie to me, because that is not perfection. Perfection is truth. So surely if I have this clear and distinct idea of the outer world, then it must be true. And then the world all of a sudden comes into being. So I think Lacan is sort of Cartesian or modern in a deeper sense. He follows Descartes a bit more, because for him, analysis is not a process of self-understanding or of self-determination. It's not a place where you learn who you are and then you are able to make better decisions for yourself. The ego, consciousness, is a secondary construction in the psyche. The unconscious is what we speak of when we speak of subjectivity in the Lacanian orientation. And in this sense, analysis does not lead you towards a moment of self-clarity, no, but it actually leads you somewhere a bit more, I would say, modest, a doing with the fact that you are split and there is nothing to do about
Well,
it.
okay, so that's a very interesting point, because I always come back to this, the idea of the coherent self, and so you have, you gave the example, you fall in love and everything is great, and then there's a part of you that is afraid, or whatever happened, has some trauma, and stops the relationship. And that is obviously something that indicates that, the volition or the general, behavior is not directed in a unified kind of way, because what the client wants is to behave according to his motivations, and his conscious motivations, let's say. And so the idea of a coherent self where all the internal voices act in unisono towards a certain goal, let's say, which is obviously impossible in a kind of way, because as we all know, 99 or how much percentage is this, most of our behavior is unconscious. And so the 1-2%, but then you have the idea to act as if you could act as a coherent being. So that is a way to integrate that which is not known, that so in that kind of direction. So you can't know, but you can act as if you know, as if you can integrate the parts that are kind of split and create a coherent self in that kind of sense. That is not Lacanian speak, by the way, but I presume that you get what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. And about this coherence, and it's a great word to use here. This coherence is what we call an erotic fantasy. Something that patients come with to the clinic, sort of asking you, I want coherence. But in a way, psychoanalysis for Lacan is a process, is a secular process. You slowly give up on this fantasy of a coherent self, of a self that is coherent, is congruent, and you give place in your life.
But isn't that, sorry to interrupt, but isn't that like a semantic kind of language game? Because if you give up on it, you create it, don't you?
Why would you say that?
Because if you give up on the illusion of a coherent self and let the split parts be split parts, right? In a kind of way, you integrate them, don't you? Isn't that the goal? That by way of detaching you from design and all these kind of things, that you can rest them as they are, but you kind of integrate them. You live with them as a dark passenger, as something that is there. You don't have to touch it, but it's there.
Yeah. If I break up your argument, then I would then ask to use a different concept, a different term for your
Sure.
conclusion. So
Right.
giving up coherence provides you with some type of, as you say, coherence, but we might call it different in a different term because
Sure.
A and B are not the same, right?
Right.
The illusion of coherence, the neurotic subject that acts as though they are self-sufficient, although they are capable of
Right.
coherence. And then the subject in analysis that sort of gives up on this fantasy, but receives some type of footing in his life when he gives up on the fantasy. These are not this identical states.
Right. No, sure. Yes. But it's like what I like about, I have some friends in Berlin at the Umwelt University, basically, who dab a little bit in occult poetry and that stuff. And so you have an idea that you have a symbol, you have something, and half of the symbol is known and half of the symbol is not known. And that which makes it so interesting, so charged in a kind of way. So you don't, the point is that you don't have to make it a coherent symbol. It is occult, it is opaque, and that's the purpose. And that's how I always feel in terms of psycho-consciousness. There's so much unknown, and it's supposed to be unknown, and it can rise up, but it's the way you deal with these kinds of tidal waves of consciousness that makes a difference.
I agree completely. You've sort of clarified a following step in analysis where we said there is a certain traversal of a fantasy, right? A traversal of the fantasy of, let's call it coherence, right? It's not the same for everyone, but let's call it coherent. So there is the traversal and a certain sort of a footing in, as you say, in a relationship to an existence that is not fully apparent,
Yes.
something hidden. And then the next question in analysis, it's a major question, is what to do with that?
Right.
It is a question of a different knowledge. It is a savoir-faire here. It is a question of how to live now.
Yeah, there's a beautiful German word for that. It's called Lebenskunst.
Oh, yes. Precisely. Lebenskunst. I like that. It reminds me a little bit of, I think Maurice Merleau-Ponty develops the notion of style in his phenomenology. And it's something like that, right? It's you find your style. It's a style of what to do. It's a style of doing with lack, basically.
Well, yes, perfect. So it's so interesting because especially in the arts, if you have literature, if you have, jazz music, you'll find these paragons or these experts in arts that kind of talk about exactly this. If you read a novel from The Dirty Old Man, Henry Miller, for example, it's like that's what he's talking about in all of his books. And there's sex in between and it's all fine and good. But Miles Davis, why is it so complicated to sound like myself? So it's like it's the way of, okay, so how do you develop a relationship to the unknown, to the opaque, to the occult within yourself, and make a Lebenskunst out of it, and become what you're supposed to be. But I guess you have to live till 60, 30 to really are able to bring this into fruition.
Well, and here, I think this type of analytic practice takes a huge step away from many others because it lacks the notion of adaptability, of adapting to reality. Many forms of psychoanalysis today, analysts have a certain idea. Yes, I've went to analysis. I know how things are and how you should be. And you need to adapt to reality. There's a reality and you have to adapt yourself to it.
Right.
And in Lebenskunst, it is not that there is one way to live in.
Right.
There is one way to do it. And we analysts, we don't know what will be this Lebenskunst. We are
Right.
just there to accompany you in the best way that we can so that you can find it.
Right.
And then analysis ends. And I think that's important. Analysis should end
Right.
at a certain point where the analyst is not needed anymore. Mm?
Right.
Mhm. Because, when one chooses a Lebenskunst, well, what is there? Well, maybe we can meet a little bit. What is there more to do, I guess? Mm?
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of, modernity as an era, as an epoch,
Mhm.
and postmodernity, which started, basically around 80, 70, 1910, something around that. And I was always kind of thinking, and this is a contentious claim, that's a very controversial claim because nobody knows after all. But at least I thought always about psychology and psychoanalysis analysis as the kind of first postmodern
Mm.
sciences, if you say so, because what happened was that, modernity and modernism, always had like this kind of subject-object relationship,
Mhm.
the mechanism and, the rigidity that led to the Holocaust and the lager and the Shoah as an example of an exaggerated pathology of modernity, right?
Mhm.
And so, the machinery of death and all of this. And
Mhm.
all of this was kind of running with the paradigm of the subject-object relationship. So you have an Innenwelt and an Außenwelt, which is kind of completely, there's a Grand Canyon between these two, but there is an Außenwelt. And then came, of course, the postmodern kind of paradigm shift or shift in the meta narrative, which is like, and I alluded to this, where all these kind of philosophers and systems theorists and psychologists said, okay, so what if this system, this subject object relationship is within the psyche? So you have Piaget that says, the boundary between the inner and the outer is a concept, right?
Mhm.
That you have to learn. Because like when you are like a child, when you're like a baby, there is no boundary between you and the mother. And so you
Mhm.
have to learn. And so you have all these constructivists that say, well, we create the concepts, we project them outwards. And so you have the whole, in short, the whole of psychology and psychoanalysis running with a different paradigm. It's not, the optimal way of relating to the outer world. It's kind of, you have to find your way to live within your own milieu in a kind of way to create a Lebenskunst and to find a way to harmonize all, all which is in your perceptual realm, let's say.
Mhm.
Sorry, that was a little bit of a rambling, but this is how I frame it in a kind of way to understand what was going on around the turn of the century.
Yes, and if this is the practice, a question that we asked then, what type of a science is psychoanalysis? And this was a question that Freud was very, very concerned about because, he wanted psychoanalysis to be a science. He didn't want it to be an art form. And well, Lacan was following Freud on that question. And there's a very famous paper by Freud called The Question of a Weltanschauung, again with the German words today. So it's a worldview, maybe, we might say in English, right? A Weltanschauung. And Freud does there a certain maneuver that I think resonates what you were speaking about as viewing psychoanalysis as a different type of science, a science that is born out of a rupture. And this
Right,
is the fact that science prior to Freud had a Weltanschauung, had a worldview. So there was
right,
an idea that science is a practice that can explain everything.
right,
And I think the step towards postmodernity is a movement from the Weltanschauung to the question of discourse. And in
right,
this, science is a discourse. It is one discourse among many discourses. It has its ideas and conceptions, and they are very important and useful, but it also has its blind spots. And
right,
psychoanalysis is similar to that. So psychoanalysis is scientific par excellence because it is a science that lacks a Weltanschauung. It's a postmodern or even a hypermodern science because it is a science. Well, we have a science and it has a practice and it has a theory. But it is not a science that presumes to know everything about everything. It's a
Well, it
science
is
that
an episteme, no? Like what Foucault said. So you have different epistemes, like you have a modern and you have a pre-modern. So, but what do you mean with hypermodern in this sense? You slipped that in there, hoping that I didn't notice.
Well, just to be a bit careful in saying that we are a step beyond modernity, because I think that the promise of modernity that did come with Descartes, I think, and it has not been fully
Exhausted, yes.
exhausted. Exactly. And this is not so much the idea of a thinking being or etc. I think it appears in mostly in Descartes' writing about culture, right? This is not so much his philosophy, but he is saying that something that's quite new in the field that well, all of the different cultural perspectives and different upbringings might create subjects that have different inclinations and ideas, but there is something essential about each subjectivity that cannot be captured by these. Now, on the one hand, we can say this is essentialist. He's saying, oh, there is some type of humanity, and we might say, okay, we done that. This is existentialism or phenomenology. But I think that the discovery here is different. It is not that we have something positivistic in each one of us. I don't know, the Dasein, the flesh, the whatever. It is the fact that the modern subject is defined as non-belonging to any category. It
Right,
is a universal, not a universal category that defines humanity, but it is a universal lack that defines the modern subject. And I think that that was the discovery of modernity, and this is what Freud is working on, as well as Lacan. And I think that this has not been exhausted today. I think that we see it in politics, we see it in our science. It is all about identities, about finding something that defines us, about
right,
questions of inclusion. Whereas what was so unique about modernity is that it made all of these categories completely obsolete.
right.
Mhm. So this is
Well,
why I'm afraid of saying postmodern,
yes.
right? Because I think we still have some work to do. Yes.
No, I mean, I'm just mentioning that because I mean there are postmodern movements in arts and philosophy, in cultural movements and movies and literature. But then you have all these kinds of endeavors which are kind of reach above postmodernity, postmodern movements, metamodernism, hypermodernism, all these kinds of isms that kind of want to elude that they transcended
Right.
modernity and postmodernity. But if you look at it, it's like they're still running. It's called still modernism, whatever prefix you have. If you post or metamodern, whatever hypermodern, it's still within the larger framework of modernity, of secularism and all these ideas that were kind of attached to it. And because it's like there's always this saying that postmodernity was about deconstruction and all of these kind of things, but this was modern science from the get-go. So it's like
I would say, let's talk about art a little bit. I think all of these expressions, not all of them, but most of the expressions that we see today in galleries, and Berlin is very rich in terms of young artists creating art. I think they're quite reactionary, not postmodern, but more reactionary in their approach to modernity. So much art today is about the artist, about the artist's traumas, about the
yeah,
artist's identities, personal struggles. And I think this is not a postmodern approach and not even a modern approach. It is some type of a reactionary approach to modernity. because modernity raises the question of non-inclusion, of non-being, of universal non-belonging,
Right.
as what McGowan says, and turning it into a question of, I think, sort of a narcissistic engagement with one's identity, with one's own experience of detachment, is not the goal here. I
Right.
think. So this is how I view things, and this is why I'm a bit careful in saying postmodern. Today, postmodern in some circles has become some type of a derogatory term,
Right.
in it, right?
But
So
no,
yeah,
you said hypermodern.
that's
I was just reacting to this. So okay, so did draw you to Lacan? Like, what is it that you decided to um, go down that rabbit hole? Because that's not just one decision that you made, but you made it your career. You went down that rabbit hole again and again and again, and maybe in the search of something.
yes.
No, because it's like we all are driven towards something, in the tapestry of cultural life, everybody has an interest, everybody has something, a diamond, something that he is drawn to, um, in the search for something. So what was it that drew you to Lacan in the first place?
Well, there's a whole biographical story about an accident, and yeah, I stumbled upon him, so that was a complete accident. But without getting into the specifics, just saying that, it is something that one has to accommodate to when working on Lacan. And this is sort of a letting go of the idea that if I study the concepts well enough and speak them in a correct enough manner, then I will get it. And that will be it. Uh, And that might be true for many philosophers or many philosophies. But I think that in order to read Lacan, one actually has to pay more attention to the fact that language is not such a strict, concrete form. Language constantly slides, meaning slides under the signifiers that come to convey them. And this type of incompleteness, I think, characterizes Lacan's work. Right? It is not a complete philosophy. It is it is something that constantly slides, constantly changes. It is very dynamic. And there's something to it on the level of the theory, but also on the level of the style. Mm. And I think it exemplifies exactly what we spoken earlier. Not a question of doing something with the concrete, doing something with the transparent, with the coherent, but doing something with lack. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It
Hmm.
keeps me going. It keeps me going. It keeps me coming back. It keeps me reading. It keeps me studying and growing in my own formation as an analyst. Because there's this certain sort of axiom at its basis. There,
Is Lack a term from Lacan? Is he something who worked with Lack?
yes, yes.
Yes. Okay.
It's quite embedded in his
Okay.
vocabulary.
So that thing that made you, and I choose these words carefully, that made you fall in love with Lacan and not say with Lyotard or Foucault or Jung as a complete different kind of psychologist. So the thing that made you fall in love with Lacan was the idea of dealing with lack.
Yes,
Did I
absolutely.
get that? Yes.
Yes. And lack is the precursor for desire. What is desire if not a movement towards lack? Uh, because if it was otherwise, if desire was a movement towards an object that we can get, then it would be quite fleeting. We would not experience it. But desire is something that keeps on operating in our lives, not because we get what we want, exactly because we constantly defer getting what we want. And I think working with Lacan is working with desire. It is a pure desire in this sense.
You said working towards desire and toward, no, you said desire is working towards lack. Isn't
Yes.
that, I wonder, I mean, it's not really towards lack, isn't it? It's out of lack.
Um, well, lack is its cause, we might say.
Right.
Mm.
Yes. But I'm
Uh,
not, I'm not going towards the lack, or do I? That would be the kind of psychoanalysis if we subconsciously looking for lack in order to feel desire.
I'll give you two metaphors to engage with that. One is more psychoanalytic. You know, Freud speaks about castration
Right.
as an originary moment, let's say, an originary logical moment. Is a moment where something is taken away, but it's something that was never there. Mm. So castration is not when you have something and someone takes it from you and then you want to get it. For Freud, castration is a bit more primordial. It has to do with the Urverdrängung, with the primal repression, not with
Right.
repression itself. So castration is in fact a certain operation that creates a lack of something that was never there. And that's very important because desire originates from this lack and constantly attempt to compensate for it, but can never compensate for it because there was nothing there. Yes, we keep on searching for it. Yes, but it is in fact nothing. This is a psychoanalytic metaphor, but a more compelling metaphor we can find in Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. You know this story?
Sure.
Achilles is a great athlete, you know, he's very fast, very quick, and he goes and has a competition with a turtle. And because he's such a great athlete, he tells the turtle, "Okay, you can start, and I'll start after you, and I'm still gonna kick your ass." Yes. And the turtle starts, and the paradox is a paradox about sort of an infinite series of decreased sums.
Sure.
But basically, it says the turtle goes 100 meters, and then Achilles starts. So he covers 100, but the turtle doesn't wait. He goes another 10. And he covers 10, and the turtle doesn't wait. He goes 5, 1, half, etc.
Right.
Ad infinitum, right? It goes on forever. Desire is something like that. It's a movement towards infinity. Hmm? And you might
My
say, well,
desire always grows, by the way.
that's great. That's great.
It doesn't get smaller, it gets bigger by the age, and that's really annoying to me because I think it should decrease, but I feel like with 70 I will be the most horny man, I think.
Well, then this is why not everyone needs to go to analysis. Some people are fine. They don't need to engage with their desires and fantasies in this way. So yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is the idea. And I think that Lacan chasing Lacan is something like chasing the turtle. Mm. And it produces a satisfaction. And
Right.
you might say I'm addicted to it. I'm addicted to this type of satisfaction.
Right. Mm. Yeah. So what is then the biggest misconception about Lacan nowadays?
Oh, there's so many. Um, the biggest one, I would say, well, first of all, the biggest misconception about Lacanian analysis, to my view, and I see it a lot with people who come to see me, is that analysis is an intellectual endeavor. That analysis is, in fact, a meeting, a session where will engage with some intellectual pursuit, where you will be thinking very deeply and strongly about philosophical or existential ideas. And that is, and people tell me, oh, Lacanian analysis, you need to be a PhD to do it. You need to be like an intellectual or interested in philosophy or something like that. But that is the biggest misconception because it is not an intellectual pursuit. It is the opposite. And in fact,
Right.
a lot of time is spent to go away, step away from this position of philosopher or, I don't know, rational thinker, etc., etc. So I think that's the biggest misconception that I would I would associate with Lacanian analysis today.
Right. Mm. I wonder how to frame this, because I mean, psychotherapy, yes, psychoanalysis historically had a better standing than it has today, no? Is that a correct assumption?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder why that is. I mean, I've had a book here. It's a Wolfgang Balzer. He analyzes scientific theories on their merit, on their output, let's say, and he put Freud's psychoanalysis through his analytic model of evaluating scientific theories. And his conclusion was there's no use for this. And so the question is, like, what is the gain from psychoanalysis that people normally don't see when they talk about, you know, these kind of things?
Well, first I would say that I think that psychoanalysis is not so prevalent today as it was as a clinical practice.
Right.
I think, you know, in film departments, literature departments, there's a lot of Lacan going on there. There's a lot
Right.
but I think that in the clinical dimension, we just experienced a reactionary movements on both levels. First, within science, sort of moving away from what Freud was discussing, a science that lacks a Weltanschauung, yeah, a science that is modern,
Right.
returning to a more scholastic idea of scientificity. And this is what we see, and I have some colleagues that sort of are very much obsessed with the question of empirical results. What can I quantify? How can I speak about it in this language of all languages? So this reactionary movement in the psychology departments, mainly pushed by the cognitive revolution and behavioral cognitive revolution that we saw in these departments, made psychoanalysis less important.
Right.
We also see a reactionary movement within psychoanalysis that made it irrelevant today. And I think this is a movement towards conservatism. And so, as I was saying, this idea of a reality that the analyst knows and the adaptation to this reality and sort of teaching someone how to adapt to reality. And this made psychoanalysis into more of a type of an educational, pedagogical, even authoritarian type of practice. You know, we know what's good for you and we will tell you what to do it. And I think cognitive behavioral psychologists do it better. They have their 12-session scheme and they can convince you to do something because it is good for you. And in this sense, psychoanalysis is obsolete. Why do we need psychoanalysis if we do the same thing?
Right.
Right. But what is very important about psychoanalysis, or as you asked, what is beneficial about it for us today? And you know, Lacan speaks about the human subject as a speaking being, sometimes even calls a speaking body. Is that psychoanalysis, and at least the Lacanian form of psychoanalysis, provides someone with an opportunity to speak differently, to speak in a way that you do not speak in the university department.
Right.
You do not speak at home or on TV or on social media or with your friends. To speak in a different way and to be listened to differently. And this is the whole premise. It's nothing magical here. What Freud promised. Freud was saying when one speaks differently and is listened to differently,
right,
then we might expect an analytic effect.
Right. Okay.
So the idea is that the symptom that causes suffering, but not all symptoms bring people to the clinic, as you just confessed. Yeah, not all symptoms are problematic. Yeah, not all symptoms cause
Yeah, but I mean
problems.
the interesting thing, and sorry to interrupt you, but we talked about this briefly in the pre-talk, the relationship between culture and trauma, let's say, and the ways you are embedded in a kind of cultural language or in a cultural substructure, and how that kind of frames the way you look at certain phenomena in your life. There are like these many examples of how, you know, uh, um, rape or sexual encounters are framed in different cultures, right?
Yeah.
So, and how much the cultural background is responsible in a kind of way of creating the trauma, right, through certain language games,
Yes.
right? And so the question then is, or the point I think you're alluding to is like how, the relationship between the cultural context, the language, and what happens if we change the language in terms of how I view myself and how I can act in the world.
Precisely, exactly. It's like, sometimes we do something so much, so many times, yeah, the same. We speak about something so similarly that we're stuck. We just stuck in the repetition of the same narrative, the same words. And as you say, we collect them from all around us, from culture, from our family, from our experience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Psychoanalysis is premised on the idea that if you are able to speak something differently, you might have an effect on this unconscious thing that keeps on repeating.
Right,
It is the idea that I cannot just decide tomorrow to change it. There is a split. I cannot consciously just say, you know what, I don't like this, I'll act differently. There's a reason it operates in this way, and there's a reason why you're stuck in it for so deeply. So you speak differently with the hopes of having an effect on it. Huh? You
right,
don't re-articulate it, as you were saying. You don't use words in order to catch it and to control it. Huh? You speak in the hope that this type of speaking will create a change in this repetition.
right, right. Go ahead. No, I was just wondering if that was, the example I was referring to, that was like two students, I think it was in Boston, Harvard University or whatever, like having consensual sex, both first or second semester. I had, a whole WhatsApp chat, for setting up a date, and they were drinking something and everything was fine, and then they had sex. And half a year later, also the female student went to the counselor uh, regarding a completely different thing. And while talking, she mentioned that incident, that she was hooking up with a male student, and that they were like under the influence of alcohol. And so the counselor was then playing that language game, oh, that was rape because, you were both drunk, and he should have had the control about the situation. So that kind of framing created a retroactively a trauma about that incident, right? And so that's a very famous example of how the language and the language game create an environment, an Umwelt or milieu, where certain traumas or neurosis can emerge.
Yes, and you see that in this type of discourse, it is knowledge that sits in the place of a master.
Right,
Knowledge determines what you experience. It is my knowledge, as you say, the language game, what it means to be abused, what it means to give consent. Knowledge will tell you who you are and what you did and what you desired and how that was. Whereas
right,
psychoanalysis, the Lacanian form of psychoanalysis, is a discourse where it is not knowledge, but in fact, as you were saying, lack is the driver of the discourse. There is
right,
always a split. You are never fully one thing. You are never fully that or not that. You are never fully
right,
consensual or not consensual. And you flirt with that and start thinking about it, start speaking about it. And an analyst will never tell someone, oh, you were in fact this and that. Well, a Lacanian
right,
analyst. Huh?
right.
is something that is on the side of the analysand, of the
Okay,
patient.
so one question that always bugs me because I don't have an answer. Maybe you can help me to go one step further in this. So there's something that I call the psychologist trap, basically, which is like, okay, it's complex because on one side, you need to choose kind of what kind of therapy you want to have, right? And so on the other side, you as a psychologist must contend with the fact that the client doesn't know if your therapeutic approach is the right one, right? Then you are kind of under pressure because also you want to earn money, you know? So like the trap is, you know, how much are you bound to financial incentives? Like how fast can you release the client, right? So then there's the problem also pertaining to this, that you have to know as a psychologist that you're creating a kind of problem solving, you know, a problem observing modus operandi for the client. So it's like he looks at his world under like a traumatic lens in a kind of sense, right? So you have you have clients that hop from one psychologist to another, and they go on for 10 or 20 years without having any progression because they have made the going to the psychologist a game for themselves to structure the time to have secondary benefits, right? And so so you have the additional problem that you, by using, for example, Lacanian language, creating your own language games, which certainly might produce its own problems. So you have, you know, all of kinds of complexities in dealing with clients, you know, all these kind of uncertainties. It's like, do you create additional problems by encouraging the client to go to therapy and to your kind of therapy? Do you get what I'm saying? And this is like a kind of problem because you want to act, you want to help, you know, you want to use the tools to make the lives of people better, but it's never monocausal. It's like there are so many unintended consequences of using language, right? So how you get what I'm saying? You understand what I mean? It's like how do you as a therapist, as a Lacanian, deal with that complexity and with this? How do you make a Lebenskunst out of your practice? I guess that's the question.
Yes, I think it's a question. It's an ethical question. It's a
Right,
question about ethics of the practice. How do you have an ethical practice? How do you not just be a charlatan that exploits people for the sake of profit?
right,
Uh, and I think that in terms of psychoanalysis, the ethics then revolves around the question, how do you listen well? How
right,
do you listen well? And it's a major aspect that one has to take into account when being an analyst, and particularly in your supervision. And I'll give you an example from a story about Lacan. You know, he was known to have very short sessions, and he would take money from his patients. He loved money, and they would put the money on his desk, and the story would say his desk was just full of bills. You know, after the end of the day, it was just full of these franc bills. And when he was older, he lived alone in his home, and he was worried that one of his patients, maybe, I don't know, a patient that's a bit problematic, would beat him up and take the money. And that disturbed his listening because he would listen to the patient and was constantly think, oh, is something going to happen? And the story is, the legend goes that he would keep a knuckle buster in his pocket. This is, you know, the puncher that you put on
right.
your hand. Now, obviously, Lacan, 70-year-old, even more, could not overtake the patient in any circumstances. But this little object, we might call it a transferential object, because it has to do with the transference, helped him listen well.
Right.
On the same note, I would say,
Maybe he
like,
just had a lack in his life to beating up people and wanted to do it so badly. So he was like, I mean, like a psychologist would argue that what was he was looking for. You know, to
Perhaps,
finally beat
perhaps,
somebody up.
perhaps it is just a legend, I'm telling you, to make a point. I have no idea about
No.
Lacan psychology, but it brings me to my point. Maybe it could be one of the last points in our talk, but that there is something that's very important as an analyst for your own listening. And I would say it is not expecting the patient to come next week, not
Right, right,
expecting that the patient will continue the analysis. Because if you do, you are so focused on appeasing them, giving them a right interpretation, letting them feel welcome, but
right,
you listen. If you
right,
need to be ethical, you need to take that away from the picture. And that
right,
means one thing. It means listening well equals not involving your own fantasies
right,
within the analytical process, not using your own language to describe whatever the analysand is describing, allowing the otherness of the analysand, the otherness of the other to articulate itself, and
right,
not telling the other what you think, what you feel they are trying to say. And I think
right.
when you do that, you have an ethical practice. And in this sense, you can also go beyond the fallacy or the problematic that you described quite clearly here, that has a lot to do with the psi practices, with the
Right. I
therapy.
mean, that's great. And that, you know, I don't want to be like come off as a contrarian. It's a question that I have. So, but aren't you, even by listening, and maybe that's a stupid question, creating in a sort of, I don't want to say language games, but creating environment that can have unintended consequences.
Of course. And I'll tell you more than that. Because an interpretation is, when you give an interpretation, you do not know what its effect will be, until a few sessions later. It is not that you give an interpretation and then the analysand is saying, oh, that was very smart. And then you know, oh, I'm smart, I did it well. This is not a sign that an interpretation had an effect. An interpretation might produce new material, might produce dreams. This is what we're there to do. Now, because you have no capacity to know if your interventions actually hit the spot, yeah, of course. Analysis is not something that is predictable. If that would be the case, we could quantify it and make it into an empirical research.
So you making the interpretation, or you let the client do the interpretation of his own material?
Well, most of the work is on the side of the analysand, but the analyst has to interpret from time to time. Yes.
Right,
And the interpretation aims not at closing up the process of meaning making, as
right.
for instance, let's use the example that you gave. You are taking the knuckle buster because you have a fantasy to beat up other people. That closes up meaning making. Like it tells the analysand what he is. It tells this is who you are. I know it. It opens up an interpretation.
But that's
Actually,
why comedy is so important, you know, because it takes the obvious and makes a joke out of it, you know?
absolutely. And this is why I would trust much more a patient that laughs after an interpretation, a patient
Well, yeah.
that tells me, oh, that was very smart. Yes.
Right. Great, Leon. I think we got it for today.
Okay.
That
Okay.
was
Well,
fantastic. I really enjoyed it, really,
yeah,
because I told you in the pre-talk, I've read one or two books of Lacan. I'm not everything else I got through cultural osmosis,
of course, yes.
basically. So I'm always very happy to get educated here.
Gladly, my pleasure. I had fun too.